carriers out at sea was one of the most fortunate things that happened. Because had they been in there and been in port, and had they been destroyed, we would not have been able to have taken the war to Japan. It would have set us back a year.
Had the carriers been in harbor, I think Nagumo would have launched the third wave to finish off the carriers and ships, dockyards, and all. He could not take a chance in launching a third wave without knowing where the American carriers were.
This third wave attack never happened. With the battleship sunk and the American carriers missing, Nagumo judged his mission was accomplished. He headed for home.
Admiral Nagumo was a cautious man by nature. He was not someone with an aviation background. His plan had been to launch 2 waves to knock out the ships. He had indeed achieved the objective, and now he wanted to make an escape before the Americans could counterattack.
But had the Japanese launched a third attack, taking out shipyards and fuel depots, the United States would have had to pull their crippled fleet back to San Francisco. This would have left Hawaii defenseless. Another myth explodes, that the attack was a military success for the Japanese.
Tactically looking at Pearl Harbor, it was very successful. Strategically looking at Pearl Harbor, it was a disaster. Strategically, if they had thought it out and they had listened to Yamamoto, who said, all you're going to do is awaken the industrial giant of America, and it did that.
But what if things had gone differently on December 7th? What if the United States had managed to meet the Japanese at sea? Who would have won this new Battle of Pearl Harbor?
It is my opinion that what happened at Pearl Harbor was probably the most fortunate thing that could have happened to our country.
We're about to watch history in the remaking. Today, it is hard to imagine that this paradise was once a battleground. But there are still untold numbers of unexploded bombs and torpedoes in the waters around Oahu, including several Japanese 800-pound bombs. But as horrendous as the raid on Pearl Harbor was, it could have been much worse.
Had we found out about the attack a day before, and we had sent all of our fleet out, and the Japanese had found the fleet, they'd have been sitting ducks. I think all of the battleships would have been sunk with all hands.
On December 10th, 1941, 2 prides of the British Navy, the battleships Prince of Wales and the Repulse, were attacked by 96 Japanese bombers and torpedo planes while at open sea. One of the 2, the Prince of Wales, was more modern and more heavily armed and armored than any of the U.S. battleships at Pearl Harbor. And the British were also fighting a by now declared war. But both of their ships were sent to the bottom within 2 hours of being attacked. Even the Japanese were stunned by their success.
The attack on the Prince of Wales and Repulse, even more than Pearl Harbor, had proved that Billy Mitchell was right. Air power had ended the reign of the battleship.
Only 3 days earlier, a number of America's battleships were sunk while moored in the shallow confines of Pearl Harbor. But this may be the greatest secret of December 7th. For many of those ships, the infamous surprise attack may have been a blessing in disguise.
They'll take 2 divisions of dive bombers, have them attack Wheeler Field.
What would have happened had the Americans met the Japanese on more equal terms? Part of this answer is no conjecture. The United States had detailed war plans that would have been followed in the event of an attack warning. Would those plans have allowed for an American victory? To answer this question, Unsolved History went to the Naval Museum in Washington, D.C. There, we brought together some of the foremost experts on Pearl Harbor and World War II naval tactics to refight a battle that never was. One team of experts takes the American side, the other the Japanese. Our investigative data was processed through a sophisticated computer program. Now, as we deploy the appropriate military hardware, we can calculate realistic damage reports.
What are your intentions and what are your actions?
Our scenario presupposes that the Americans get their first warning at 5:30 a.m., 2.5 hours before the airstrike would hit Oahu. Our Admiral Kimmel immediately sorties those ships which can get up steam. His plan is to rendezvous with the carrier Enterprise, which is hurrying up from the south. The Japanese have lost the crucial element of surprise.
You have no surprise, sir. There's no Tora today. What is your reaction?
Targets out there, we should designate one group apiece for each of those high priority targets with our torpedoes.
And those targets are battleships?
Those are battleships, that's correct. We ignore the cruisers and the lighter ships.
During this attack, the real damage is done. Japanese torpedo planes managed to sink 3 of the American battleships in deep water and cripple a 4th. 3 ships are lost, and many of their crew drowned in the open sea. In the real Battle of Pearl Harbor, many sailors were able to swim to safety. Not so here.
There's the possibility of a follow-up.
However, the Japanese too have paid a price. Their plane and crew losses are about 3 times higher than occurred in history.
You have 3 incapacitated airfields, but the one thing I must point out is that you suffered a grand total loss of 75 aircraft.
Admiral Toole, however, does not agree with the results of the war game scenario. Our simulation had the Japanese torpedo planes sinking 3 American battleships. Admiral Toole believes those planes would not have been so successful in a real battle.
Well, the lesson I've learned from this engagement was that the torpedo planes would have been the greatest weapon in the war, and it proved exactly the opposite. I mean, at Midway, we lost every single one of our torpedo planes that came in.
And that same very argument was being said that battleships at sea cannot be struck, that they have to maneuver, and once at sea, they're less vulnerable. Tell it to the Prince of Wales and Repulse. It was sunk just before Christmas.
Your scenario that we can't shoot down torpedo planes, and yet 6 months later, every single one of ours is wiped slick, is baloney. They would have lost more than this game gave them.
Our Battle of Pearl Harbor resulted in the total loss of 3 American battleships and most of their crews. In the real attack, the Arizona was the only total loss. Many of the other ships and their crews would fight again.
The lesson of Pearl Harbor isn't in the number of ships lost, but rather in the cost of human life. And that lesson is always bitter.
The Japanese were about to learn a bitter lesson of their own. For in one of the great hidden stories of the Second World War, they would launch a second attack on Pearl Harbor 3 months later. And some believe that attack cost them the war.
In March 1942, the Japanese sent a couple of Emily-type flying boats, that is, long-range planes capable of landing on the water, to attack Pearl Harbor. But there was a heavy cloud cover at that time, and so unwittingly, one plane flew 6 miles beyond the harbor, and the bombs dropped harmlessly onto a mountain. The other plane dropped its out at sea.
This second attack on Pearl Harbor had an unexpected benefit for the Americans. After the attack, they determined that the Japanese planes had refueled at French Frigate Shoals, an island between Hawaii and Midway.
Japanese gave away their trump card. Where are they refueling these seaplanes from?
The United States quickly sealed off these remote islands, taking this vital Japanese base out of the war.
The Japanese now could not launch recon missions over Pearl Harbor looking for our carriers to find where our capital ships were and weren't.
6 months after Pearl Harbor, those same carriers would ambush and defeat the Japanese fleet at Midway. This Japanese intelligence failure had led directly to one of the turning points of the Second World War.